The Ypres salient settles around you like a quiet, stubborn weight, not the kind that crushes, but the kind that stays, hour after hour, season after season, until men forget when it began. Nothing here truly stops. Nothing here truly moves. It is a landscape held in suspension, a place where the minutes feel stretched thin, and the days fall into one another without ever fully arriving. If these quiet moments in Ypres speak to you, the long hours, the stillness, the slow turning of time, make sure to subscribe. It helps these gentle histories continue their path toward you, arriving softly, the way waiting often does. And if you'd like, let us know where you're listening from, or which moment lingers with you the most. You're listening to Echoes of War. You stand at the edge of a reserve trench as dawn bleeds slowly into the sky. The light is pale, unspectacular, the sort of morning that no one bothers to remark upon. A British company waits here, the next link in a rotation that has been repeating for so long that even the officers struggle to remember the earliest cycles. Helmets dull with dried mud, rifles resting upright, the barrels fogging faintly in the cold. Steam rises from the men's quiet breaths, drifting upward before dissolving into nothing. This is the part of the war that rarely finds its way into stories, the long, stretched silence between frontline stints, when nothing happens and everything happens, when men think too much, or try their best not to think at all, when the trench becomes a place of holding, a place where the mind paces even when the body remains still. A corporal sits on an ammunition crate, his boots planted firmly in the hardened mud. He turns a small pencil between his fingers, tapping it lightly against a folded letter. He is not writing. He is not reading. He is simply waiting for the moment when he can convince himself to do one or the other. Beside him, a private tightens the straps on his pack for the fourth or fifth time this hour. His hands move with practiced familiarity, though there is nothing left to adjust. Men often do this when they wait. They rehearse readiness, as if the body can negotiate with uncertainty by pretending to prepare. Further down the line, two soldiers share a single enamel mug of tea. One takes a sip, hands it back, then the other mimics the gesture. They say little. Words feel unnecessary, even wasteful. Instead, they conserve their breath as they conserve everything else: warmth, energy, hope. A sergeant walks by, his steps measured, his gaze sweeping over his section with the quiet vigilance of someone who knows that waiting can fray discipline just as surely as combat. He does not speak either. A distant rumble rolls across the landscape. It is not artillery. Not this time. It is the low, grinding thunder of supply wagons moving along a road somewhere behind the lines. Even this sound carries its own meaning. It reminds the men that the front is still there, still demanding, still hungry, and that soon enough they will return to feed it. The morning stretches, slow as breath. Men check their watches, though not because they expect anything new. They check them to ensure the hands are still moving, to reassure themselves that time has not truly stopped. A light mist settles over the trench. You observe how it softens the edges of everything, the duckboards, the sandbags, the men themselves. It makes them look less like soldiers and more like silhouettes waiting to be called back into shape. The mud is firm today, cold but mercifully dry, a narrow blessing the men accept without comment. They all know it will be different in a week, or a day, or an hour. A lieutenant approaches the company from the rear. His boots are cleaner than most. He has been in the command dugout, charting the next rotation. He clears his throat softly, not to gather attention but to steady himself. When he speaks, it is with the restrained formality of someone who has repeated these instructions countless times. Stand by. 2 words. Ordinary. Barely louder than the shifting of a pack strap. Yet they pass through the trench with a subtle tightening, like a wire pulled taut. Men straighten. Tea mugs lower. Letters are folded and slipped away. The corporal tucks his pencil behind his ear. Still, no one moves. Stand by is not an order to act. It is an order to be ready to act. Another thread in the long weave of waiting. Minutes pass. Or more. Time becomes indistinct again. You notice the way some soldiers sway slightly, the way others stare at nothing in particular, the way a few close their eyes as if rehearsing a moment of thoughtlessness. There is relief in not thinking. There is danger in thinking too much. A runner arrives at last, breath showing in sharp white bursts. He hands a folded message to the lieutenant, who scans it with a careful, unreadable expression. Around him, the men remain motionless, as if the entire trench is holding its breath. And then the lieutenant raises his hand, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a slow, practiced motion that carries more weight than any shout. Prepare to move. The soldiers inhale, but still they hesitate, because even this command may be followed by more waiting. They know better than to assume immediacy. The war has taught them that movement is only ever half a promise. For a moment, no one shifts. The men remain like figures carved into the trench itself, each one suspended inside the thin space between anticipation and endurance. This thin, stretched moment, is where the real war lives in the Ypres salient. Not only in the barrages, not only in the night patrols, but here, in the long, quiet wait that settles on a man's shoulders while he waits for whatever comes next. In this place, waiting is its own battle, and every soldier fights it in silence. The hours that refuse to move. The reserve line settles into its rhythm long before anyone consciously notices it. The men of this battalion arrive in the late afternoon, boots caked with the dried remnants of yesterday's mud, shoulders tight from carrying packs that seem heavier each rotation. No one speaks loudly. Voices here are always measured, as if loudness risks disturbing something fragile in the air, or awakening something no one wishes to face again. You observe the column file into position, each man stepping onto the wooden duckboards with the careful gait of someone who has tripped too many times to trust the ground. The trench curves with the land, turning gently as it follows the contour of the shallow ridge. Sandbags slope inward, patched in places with burlap that darkened after the last rain. Nothing looks new here. Even the repairs appear fatigued. A small group settles near a low dugout entrance. A young private rests his rifle across his lap, smoothing his thumb along the cold metal as if trying to warm it. Another man, older, with a thick mustache and an unrushed way of moving, eases himself onto a sandbag and begins unlacing his boots. He does this every time they reach reserve, not because he is tired, though he is, but because it is a ritual, a small assertion of control over the hours ahead. Rituals help men survive the waiting. A kettle is hung over a small spirit burner. It hisses softly, the flame barely visible, the sound merging with a low murmur of distant artillery far to the south. The bursts are faint here, little more than thuds folded into the landscape, reminders rather than threats. The front line is not close, not yet, but its gravity pulls at the men all the same. A lance corporal sits on an upturned crate, elbows on knees, staring at the trench wall, not with dread or anticipation, simply with fatigue that has hollowed thought into something quieter. His helmet rests beside him. A pale line marks the sweat-dried rim across his forehead. He blinks slowly, the sort of blink that suggests he could fall asleep if he allowed himself just a few more seconds of stillness. The waiting always begins like this, subtly, quietly, without ceremony. A faint drizzle sweeps in, barely more than mist. It settles on shoulders and rifle stocks, darkening the cloth and leaving a sharp chill behind. No one hurries to shelter. This kind of weather is too common to warrant movement. A few men pull their collars a bit higher, others let the droplets gather and roll off naturally. In the next bay, a sergeant arranges his section with small gestures rather than orders. He checks the ammunition pouches, glancing but not touching. He makes sure each man has a dry pair of socks stored in his pack. He surveys the parapet for weak spots. Not because he expects action here, but because discipline is one of the few things that does not erode under the pressure of waiting, unless one allows it to. Near him, a private leans against the wall, notebook open, pencil hovering. The page is blank. He looks at it for a long moment, then closes the notebook without writing a single word. Some thoughts resist paper. Some feelings do not wish to be examined under the dim light of a trench lamp. A pair of pigeons flutter overhead, startled from a wire by the call of a distant wagon driver. Their wings slice a clean sound through the damp air. The men look up briefly, more out of habit than curiosity. In a place where news travels slowly and danger more slowly still, even small movements become points of focus. By dusk, rations arrive. The distribution is an exercise in quiet precision. The quartermaster sergeant works down the trench, handing out tins, bread that crumbles too easily, and tea that brings at least a moment of warmth. A few men manage faint smiles at the sight of jam, a rare addition. Others simply nod and tuck the tins into their haversacks. Soon, the smell of heated rations rises into the air, mixing with damp earth. Men gather in small clusters, shoulders touching or nearly touching, sharing warmth without acknowledging that they do so. Steam curls from mess tins. A private lifts a spoonful, blows gently, tastes it, and sets the tin on his knee. He eats slowly, stretching the meal across as many minutes as he can, not because the food is scarce, but because the act of eating offers a structure to the otherwise unmarked evening. A brief flash lights the horizon. The men pause, instinctively listening for the rumble that follows, but none comes. It is lightning, not artillery. A few breaths ease out at once. Nature's violence reminds them that not every shock is aimed at them. Night deepens. Lanterns are lit, dim and hooded. Their glow picks out tired faces, the glint of oil on rifle bolts, the worn grain of wooden grips. Inside the dugouts, men claim their allotted spaces, narrow, low-ceilinged, smelling of earth and canvas. A private settles onto a bunk of wire mesh and sodden straw. He draws a blanket to his chin and attempts to relax, though his shoulders remain tense even in rest. Waiting does not ease its grip when the body reclines. Outside, a group of sentries take their posts. They stand at intervals along the trench, watching the pathways and listening for changes in the darkness. Their silhouettes appear still, almost sculptural, but each man's gaze shifts carefully from one shape in the night to another. Reserve lines are rarely attacked, yet vigilance must hold even here. The hours are long, long enough for thoughts to wander where they should not. A corporal strikes a match to light his pipe, the flame trembling in the breeze. He shields it with cupped hands, inhales once, twice, then taps the match out against a sandbag. The glow of the pipe dims after a minute, leaving only the faint scent of tobacco woven into the evening air. Midnight comes without announcement. The men do not track the time by clocks, but by the subtle changes in the atmosphere, the cooling of the ground, the slackening of conversation, the slight shift in how the wind stirs the mud. Above the trench, clouds drift across the moon, thinning it to a pale, distant coin. A few men glance upward before returning to their steady rehearsals of endurance. This is the heart of Ypres, not the barrages, not the assaults, but the hours that refuse to move. The long stretches where waiting becomes its own landscape, shaping men in ways no one will fully understand once the war ends. Waiting was not an interruption of the Ypres salient, it was its defining architecture. The men who rotated into these reserve trenches did so with the understanding that they were stepping into a space shaped less by immediate danger and more by the steady erosion of time. The Western Front had many brutal qualities, but Ypres added one more: the ability to make a man feel suspended between movements, held in a kind of perpetual readiness that never seemed to resolve. The reserve line was meant to be a place of recovery, yet rest here rarely took the form of ease. Instead, it took the form of order, reorganizing equipment, inspecting rifles, repacking kits, preparing for conditions that everyone knew could shift with the weather or the whim of artillery. The trench systems required men to rotate constantly among front, support, and reserve, and these transitions shaped the mental rhythm of the war as much as the combat itself. In theory, the reserve line offered lower risk. In practice, its distance from the front created a different strain, one born not from direct fire but from anticipation. Soldiers knew they were close enough to be summoned at any moment, close enough to feel the echo of the guns, and yet far enough to spend long hours with nothing to do but think. This tension formed a psychological landscape as consuming as the mud or the cold. The British Expeditionary Force understood the necessity of these rotations. Units that remained too long at the front deteriorated rapidly, not only from casualties but from stress that accumulated like silt in the mind. By pulling men back on a predictable schedule, the army hoped to maintain cohesion and stamina. Yet predictability could become its own burden. When soldiers knew exactly when they were due to return to the firing line, the reserve period became a countdown rather than a reprieve. This cycle shaped even the smallest habits. Letters were written in bursts and then abandoned half-finished as men lost their focus. Boots were removed and relaced not for comfort but for the faint sense of routine it offered. Meals were stretched across long minutes in an effort to fill the expanse of unoccupied time. Rituals became psychological anchors, helping men navigate hours that might otherwise feel directionless. The trench architecture contributed to the heaviness. Reserve lines were usually narrower, less fortified, and more utilitarian than the front. Dugouts were cramped, ventilation poor, and the ever-present damp made it hard for anything, cloth, wood, or a man's mood, to stay dry for long. Yet compared to the chaos of bombardment, these discomforts were tolerable. What pressed harder was the awareness of what lay ahead. For many soldiers, the reserve line was where the mind began to drift toward the questions one avoided in the front trenches: how long the war might last, whether they would survive the next rotation, what waited on the other side of the salient when the guns eventually stopped. These thoughts were not always spoken aloud. They filtered through the silence, shaping the way men sat, the way they stirred their tea, the way they stared at nothing in particular. Silence in Ypres was not peace. It was the sound of worry held in place. Yet waiting also created unexpected forms of resilience. Men learned to endure the slow passage of hours by building internal fortifications. Small jokes shared in low voices, stories traded over enamel mugs, the simple comfort of familiarity. They learned that even in a landscape defined by uncertainty, the predictable flow of routine could steady them. Historically, the Ypres salient remained one of the most demanding and psychologically draining positions on the Western Front. Its geography placed Allied troops inside a vulnerable curve, hemmed in on three sides by higher ground. Supply routes were exposed. Observation was constant. Even reserve positions experienced enough shelling, enough gas alarms, enough nighttime confusion to prevent any sense of true safety. Still, compared to the front, the reserve line was where men could try to breathe. They slept in shallow bursts, wrote letters to loved ones, cleaned their weapons, and prepared themselves for the next phase of the rotation. The hours here were long, but they were also necessary. Without them, the front would have swallowed entire battalions whole. In this place, waiting became a skill, and sometimes a quiet act of courage. Soldiers learned to sit with the weight of uncertainty, to let the silence pass through them without breaking. They endured repetition not as monotony, but as a structure that kept them steady. You observe how this rhythm shaped the men, not through dramatic action, but through the slow patience that settled into their bones. In Ypres, courage was not only the ability to withstand bombardment, it was the ability to endure the long, suspended hours between battles, when time felt both heavy and hollow. This was the hidden war, one fought minute by minute, in trenches where nothing moved yet everything pressed down. And in these quiet spaces, soldiers carried the weight of waiting with a steadiness that history often overlooks. The shape of repetition. The following morning arrives without ceremony. Light seeps into the reserve line in thin, grey strands, spreading over duckboards and sandbags until the shapes of men begin to sharpen again. No bugle calls, no official start to the day, only the gradual lifting of darkness that signals to everyone that another cycle of waiting has begun. You observe how the trench wakes slowly. A pot clatters faintly somewhere near a dugout. A match flares as a soldier lights a cigarette, its glow a small ember in the cool air. Another man adjusts the strap of his webbing with practiced motions, the leather creaking softly. Nothing is hurried. Nothing is still. The trench breathes in slow rhythm. Repetition defines the space more than any physical structure. Men move about their tasks not because they are ordered to, but because the body seeks familiarity when the mind struggles to find direction. A private drapes his damp socks over a line he rigged from signal wire. A corporal checks the same rifle bolt he checked last night, tilting it to catch the weak light. A pair of soldiers argue quietly about whether the tea tastes better here or at the support line, though neither truly cares about the answer. The conversation is simply a way to carve sound into the silence. On a ledge carved into the trench wall, a small group gathers around a tin of jam. They scoop it with broken biscuits, sharing without comment. The jam is too sweet, too sticky, but it brings a faint spark of color into a morning otherwise washed in brown and gray. One soldier holds the tin up to the light, as if reminding himself that small, unexpected comforts still have a place in the war. Across the walkway, a young man unwraps a parcel from home. The paper is damp and softened at the edges. Inside are socks, a short note, and a small cake that has crumbled slightly during transport. He breaks it carefully, handing pieces to the men nearest him. They accept wordlessly. There is no need for thanks. Gifts from home belong to everyone in the immediate circle, a brief moment of sweetness shared against the heaviness of the routine. Farther down the trench, a team of engineers makes adjustments to the drainage ditch. They scrape mud from the boards, reinforcing them with fresh timber brought in by mule carts the night before. Their tools strike wood with dull, muted thuds. These sounds are part of the repertoire of the reserve line, quiet, methodical, reassuring in their predictability. Men hear them and know that the day has begun properly. A runner hurries past, boots splashing in shallow puddles left by last night's drizzle. He carries a message pouch strapped tight across his chest, but he does not slow or speak as he passes. Runners always move quickly, even in reserve. Their pace unsettles some of the men. Sudden movement here feels like a disruption to the slow rhythm they have settled into. A few soldiers glance after him, then return to their routines with a small shake of the head, as if reminding themselves that urgency belongs to another part of the line. In a sheltered corner, a sergeant lays out cleaning kits for the morning inspection. It is not necessary, not strictly, yet he insists on it because routine grants structure, and structure helps the men feel anchored. They clean mud from their boots, oil their rifles, check their equipment, Small acts that suggest control even when the broader circumstances allow very little. The sergeant moves between them, nodding quietly at their work, offering a single word here, a gentle reminder there. His presence steadies the atmosphere more than any inspection could. A faint wind sweeps along the trench. It brings the smell of damp earth, wood smoke from distant cookhouses, and somewhere farther west the faint odor of cordite from a battery testing its guns. The men inhale these scents without reacting. They have learned to read them not as warnings but as markers of distance, direction, and time. The front line is not close, not today, but it hums at the edge of every thought. A soldier sitting near a junction pulls a harmonica from his pocket. He turns it in his hands before lifting it to his lips. The notes that escape are soft, wavering, unsure of themselves. He plays only a few bars before stopping, perhaps self-conscious, perhaps unwilling to disturb the fragile quiet. Still, the sound leaves a faint echo, a reminder that music exists even in places that seem resistant to it. Around mid-morning, a pair of mules appears at the trench entrance, their hooves muffled by mud. The driver guides them carefully, avoiding sudden turns. The animals carry crates of rations, replacement tools, and bundles of sandbags. Their arrival draws a few curious glances. Not because the supplies are unusual, but because the mules represent a rare kind of movement, a reminder that the world beyond the reserve line still functions, still shifts, still changes in ways that feel distant here. As the men unload the crates, the rhythm of the trench shifts slightly. Hands reach out instinctively. Boots shuffle to make space. A lieutenant appears, marking items off in a small notebook. He speaks to no one in particular, but his presence suggests plans, timing, coordination. The men watch him without expectation. Officers bring structure to the hours, but the hours rarely obey. After the supplies are distributed, the trench settles back into quiet. A few soldiers lean against the wall, letting the weak sunlight warm their shoulders. Others sit on their packs, heads bowed, either resting or sinking into the familiar fog of thought that accompanies long stretches of waiting. The mood is neither despair nor calm. It is something in between, a muted endurance learned slowly, painfully, over the course of months. Repetition becomes a form of insulation. It shields the men from the sharper edges of fear, dulls the impact of expectation, and transforms time into something that feels less like a threat and more like a companion. In Ypres, repetition is not merely survival. It is the framework that holds the men in place. A distant rumble shakes the boards faintly. The soldiers pause, listening. It fades. A test fire, likely. No one comments. They have learned not to fill silence with unnecessary guesses. They return to their tasks, their thoughts, their small, grounding rituals. This is how a day in the reserve line unfolds, not with movement, but with pattern, not with drama, but with rhythm. A world repeating itself so faithfully that even the smallest deviation feels significant. And through it all, the weight of waiting settles deeper into the landscape, shaping every gesture, every pause, every slow breath. The repetition that filled the reserve trenches at Ypres was not accidental or incidental. It emerged from the structure of trench warfare itself, especially in places where the front line pressed into a precarious curve. The Ypres salient became a site where soldiers learned to live inside cycles, not intense enough to break them outright, yet demanding enough to erode them gradually. British and Commonwealth forces relied on a system of predictable rotations meant to maintain cohesion. A battalion might spend a few days in the front line, followed by a brief period in the support trenches, and then a longer stretch in reserve. On paper, this pattern gave men time to recover, reorganize, and prepare for the next phase. In practice, the reserve line often felt less like rest and more like a pause in a long sequence of strain. The work in reserve was steady, necessary, and rarely dramatic. Soldiers repaired equipment, cleaned weapons, tended to their rations, wrote letters, and checked for lice. They patched sandbags, reinforced duckboards, and maintained the drainage systems that kept the worst mud at bay. Each task had a practical purpose, but each also served a psychological function. Routines provided structure when the larger shape of the war felt uncertain and overwhelming. Repetition created its own form of endurance. When men performed the same motions day after day, they found themselves slipping into rhythms that felt almost meditative. Cleaning a rifle, boiling tea, organizing a pack. These small rituals became ways to anchor the mind, to create a sense of predictability in a landscape where unpredictability could strike without warning. The familiarity of routine softened the edges of fear, even as it drew attention to the fact that nothing truly changed. Historically, the British command understood the risk of allowing units to remain too long at the front. The strain of unbroken combat exposure led to rapid deterioration, both in effectiveness and morale. Rotations into the reserve were designed to prevent collapse. But the psychological relief these breaks offered varied widely. For some, the quieter trenches felt like a chance to breathe. For others, the stillness magnified their anxieties, giving the mind too much room to wander. In the Ypres salient especially, the reserve line was not entirely safe. Though sheltered from direct assaults, it remained within range of long-distance shelling, gas alarms, and the confusion of night operations. A sudden blast in the distance, or a stray shell landing close by could remind soldiers that they remained within the grip of the front. This uncertainty colored every moment. Rest was possible, but it was never secure. Repetition also influenced relationships among soldiers. When men performed the same tasks alongside the same faces day after day, a quiet intimacy developed. They understood each other's moods, habits, and silences. A man who tapped his fingers against his mess tin might be anxious. Another who stared too long at the trench wall might be drifting into thoughts he did not want to name. These subtle signals helped comrades support one another in ways that rarely appeared in official reports. Letters from home played a central role in these cycles. Soldiers often read them repeatedly, not for new information but for the reassurance contained in familiar handwriting. Parcels, even when damaged or delayed, offered tastes and textures from a world far removed from the trenches. Sharing these gifts became its own quiet ritual, reinforcing bonds formed through shared endurance. Above all, repetition prepared soldiers for the next shift forward. The routines of reserve life, cleaning, repairing, resting, were designed to ready them for the harsher tasks ahead. The predictability of these days created a backdrop against which the uncertainty of the front line felt both inevitable and survivable. When the time came to move up, the men did so with a resignation shaped by the steady cadence of waiting. Measured from the outside, reserve periods might appear uneventful, but within them, soldiers navigated a complex emotional landscape. Fear, boredom, camaraderie, hope, and resignation intertwined. The slow pace magnified small moments, both comforting and painful. A warm drink could feel profound. A sudden memory of home could overwhelm the senses. Each day was simple on the surface, yet heavy beneath. You observe how this repetition became the silent architecture of the Ypres salient. It influenced the men more deeply than many realized at the time. In the long arc of the war, battles marked the maps and shaped the headlines, but the waiting, the steady, unending cycles, shaped the men themselves. It taught them how to endure inside a world that refused to move at the speed of their fears or hopes. In Ypres, repetition was not monotony. It was the quiet engine that kept battalions functioning, the scaffold that held men upright, and the slow, patient force that left its own kind of scar. Night without rest. Night descends over the reserve line with a weight that feels heavier than daylight. Darkness does not simply replace the afternoon. It settles into the trench, filling every corner and hollow until the world shrinks to the faint glow of hooded lanterns and the soft rhythm of men breathing in narrow dugouts. Night in Ypres is not quiet. It only sounds quiet to those who have never lived within it. You observe how the trench changes as the last pale streaks fade from the sky. The boards creak differently beneath boots. The air grows sharper, carrying a chill that slips beneath greatcoats and settles against bone. A faint mist drifts across the parapet, gathering in thin ribbons that catch the lantern light before dissolving. The darkness presses close, giving each man the sense of standing inside his own narrow world. Fatigue deepens here, not the exhaustion of battle, but the slower, more corrosive kind that arrives with too many nights spent half awake. Soldiers move with careful steps, not to avoid noise, but because the body resists motion after a day of holding tension. A corporal rubs his eyes with the heel of his palm, then checks his watch, though he already knows the time. The night watches change at predictable intervals. But predictability brings no comfort when sleep refuses to come. Inside a dugout, men settle onto bunks arranged in tight rows. A few remove their boots. Most leave them on to avoid the shock of cold mud should they be called out suddenly. Blankets are pulled close, though they never feel warm. Lantern light flickers along the earthen walls, revealing faces slack with weariness. Some breathe steadily within minutes. Others lie with their eyes open, staring at the timber beams overhead as if they could read the hours written there. Above the dugout, sentries take their positions. The rotation is quiet, almost ritualistic. A sergeant hands over the post with a small nod, stepping back as another soldier takes his place. The night air is damp enough to bead on steel helmets. Rifles are kept ready, though the threat here is more often imagined than real. Still, vigilance is demanded. Men listen for sounds that should not be there. Distant footsteps, unusual echoes, anything that breaks the fragile pattern of the night. What they hear instead are the small noises that define the darkness. A tin mug shifting in a pocket, the soft thump of a boot against a duckboard, the exhale of a man settling his weight. Beyond the trench, somewhere in the obscured distance, heavy guns test their aim. The thunder arrives softened by miles, like a storm moving behind a curtain. Each rumble reminds the men that the front line never sleeps, even if they must attempt to. A private sits at the corner of a communication trench, his back against the wall, a blanket wrapped tightly around his shoulders. He keeps drifting into shallow dozes, each one broken by the smallest disturbance, a cough, a shift of gravel, the scrape of a shovel. When he wakes, his breath catches for a moment, as if he is not sure where he is. This is common in the reserve line. Exhaustion blurs the familiar shapes of the trench until even rest feels disorienting. Farther down, two soldiers share the muffled conversation that rises only at night. Their voices are low, nearly lost in the air. They speak of nothing that requires answers, a memory of home, a friend stationed elsewhere, a joke repeated without conviction. Words serve as a thin barrier against the quiet, a reassurance that someone else is awake, listening, alive. A lantern flickers near the trench junction, its flame struggling against the cold. A runner arrives, breath forming short, hurried clouds. He hands a folded slip of paper to the corporal in charge of the watch. The corporal reads it, folds it again, and tucks it into his pocket without changing expression. The message is routine, an update on supply movements, yet even routine messages unsettle the men nearest the junction. Sudden activity at night always carries the echo of things unknown. As the hours stretch, the temperature drops. Frost begins to form on the duckboards, giving them a faint, brittle sheen. A sentry stamps his feet lightly to keep his blood moving. His breath appears in small clouds that vanish almost as quickly as they form. He looks toward the faint outline of trees to the east, their branches stark against the night. The world beyond the trench feels impossibly wide and impossibly distant at the same time. Inside a dugout, someone snores. Another man shifts, muttering in his sleep. The smell of damp wool and cold earth thickens the air. A private rolls onto his side, pulling his greatcoat tighter around him. His face, lit briefly by a passing lantern, shows the kind of tiredness that no amount of rest can cure. Night in Ypres does not restore. It only suspends the weariness until morning. A sudden crack echoes across the landscape. The men freeze, listening. After a moment, it repeats, the familiar snap of timber, likely from a collapsing section of duckboard or a distant supply cart. Still, the tension lingers. In the dark, the mind assigns danger to every sound. Several soldiers glance toward the parapet before resuming their positions. The night stretches on, hour after slow hour. Sentries shift their weight. Sleepers twist beneath thin blankets. The trench holds everyone in a fragile balance, too tired to stay awake, too alert to truly sleep. The boundary between vigilance and exhaustion blurs until men feel suspended in a state that is neither rest nor wakefulness, but something in between. As dawn approaches, the darkness begins to thin at the horizon. A faint line of pale grey forms, signaling the end of another night that offered little relief. The lanterns dim one by one. Men stir in the dugouts, gathering their gear with the sluggish motions of bodies that never found true sleep. This is the nature of nights in Ypres, long, cold, and heavy with waiting. A night that does not restore, but simply prepares the men to endure another day of the same rhythm. Night in the reserve trenches of the Ypres salient carried its own distinct form of strain. While daytime brought work, routine, and the sometimes helpful distraction of movement, night confronted soldiers with stillness. It was during these hours, when the world narrowed to the dim glow of lanterns and the quiet rhythm of breathing, that fatigue pressed hardest on the mind. Historically, night watches were essential to trench life, even in positions far from the immediate front line. The British Army understood that danger could emerge from any direction: a probing patrol, a misfired shell, a sudden shift in orders that required rapid movement. Sentries were posted at regular intervals, their watches lasting 2 hours at a time. On paper, this system ensured that no man remained awake for too long. In practice, it fractured sleep into uneven fragments, leaving soldiers hovering between exhaustion and alertness. The reserve line offered fewer shocks than the front trenches, yet it still felt uncertain after dark. Long-range artillery occasionally wandered, gas alarms could sound without warning, and the confusion of night amplified every sound. A snapping branch might be a mule cart, a distant echo could be thunder, or guns, or something else entirely. Men learned to interpret noises with caution, never fully trusting their instincts. The darkness made familiar shapes seem foreign, distorting depth and direction. Sleep, when it came, arrived in shallow bursts. Soldiers rested fully clothed, boots on, gear within reach. The need for preparedness interrupted even the quietest moments. A man might drift off for 20 minutes only to wake disoriented, unsure whether he had slept at all. Over time, this fractured pattern accumulated into a deep tiredness that no single night could undo. The body adapted, but the mind bore the strain. Night also heightened introspection. With fewer tasks and less motion to occupy them, men often found their thoughts drifting toward fears kept at bay during the day. They considered the next rotation to the front, the letters they had not written, the faces of loved ones. Such reflections were rarely spoken aloud. Instead, they lingered in the dim spaces between bunk rows, unshared yet palpable. Silence became both a comfort and a burden. Despite this introspection, the night also revealed a different kind of camaraderie. Quiet conversations, exchanged in half-whispers, allowed men to connect in ways that daytime rarely permitted. Two soldiers might speak of home, of small memories, of things unrelated to the war. These moments did not erase fatigue, but they softened its edges. In the stillness, companionship became more visible. It was a thread woven delicately through the gloom, reminding the men that they endured the strain together. Lanterns played a central role in night routines. Their faint light offered both physical visibility and psychological reassurance. A glowing lantern signaled that others were awake, alert, and nearby. Yet even this light had to be controlled. Too bright, and it risked drawing attention. Too dim, and the trench sank into disorienting shadow. Soldiers developed an instinct for adjusting the flame to the right level, a quiet craft learned through necessity. Historically, the Ypres salient complicated night conditions more than other sectors. Low-lying ground encouraged mist and fog to settle in the trenches, especially during colder months. This fog blurred the outlines of the parapet, thickened the air, and muffled sound in unpredictable ways. Men spoke of nights where visibility shrank to arm's length, and where the world seemed to dissolve into a pale, shifting haze. In such conditions, even the reserve line felt precarious. The psychological toll of nights in Ypres should not be underestimated. Modern discussions of wartime fatigue sometimes focus on the trauma of open combat, but the quieter hours held their own challenges. Night after night of broken sleep, hypervigilance, and interrupted rest wore down resilience. The Army's rotation system was meant to mitigate this, yet the relentlessness of trench life often outpaced the system's ability to restore men fully. Still, soldiers found ways to endure. They adjusted to the rhythm of broken rest. They leaned on each other in unspoken ways. They learned to read the night not as an enemy, but as a landscape that required patience and caution. And though the reserve line was far from the worst position in the salient, it remained part of the same unyielding world, a place where waiting continued even after the lights dimmed. You observe how night created a dual reality, one where the body sought rest while the mind remained alert, and another where camaraderie and quiet resilience emerged within the shadows. In these overlapping layers, soldiers navigated the long hours with a steadiness built from necessity. Night in Ypres was not a reprieve. It was a continuation of the same tension that shaped the days, filtered through darkness and silence. And each dawn revealed men who had weathered yet another stretch of time, carrying its weight into the next cycle. The work that never ends. Morning arrives with a dim, colorless light, the kind that makes the world feel unfinished. The reserve trench stirs in slow fragments, the scrape of a boot along the boards, the faint clink of tinware being arranged, a cough muffled into a sleeve. Men emerge from dugouts with stiff movements, shoulders hunched against the persistent chill. The night has offered little rest, and the day ahead promises more of the same unremarkable labor that defines life behind the lines. You observe the familiar patterns returning quickly. A mess tin is filled, lifted, emptied. A man rubs warmth into his hands before reaching for a spade. Another adjusts his greatcoat, tugging at a tier that has grown slightly larger since yesterday. Soldiers speak little this early. Their silence is not solemn but practical, a conservation of energy they will need for the long hours ahead. Soon the work details assemble. A sergeant, his voice low and steady, assigns tasks with practiced efficiency. There is nothing dramatic on the list. Trench repairs, drainage maintenance, carrying sandbags, clearing debris from a collapsed section near a communications trench. Yet each assignment bears the quiet weight of necessity. The trench does not maintain itself. It shifts, sags, and dissolves under the pressure of weather and time. Every day brings another set of small failures to mend. A group heads toward the drainage channel. Their boots sink slightly into the cold mud, which clings with a stubbornness that feels almost personal. The men work with shovels and trench tools, scooping out muck, clearing blockages, reinforcing the boards. Their movements are steady, unhurried. This is not work done with urgency, but with resignation, the knowledge that tomorrow, or the next rain, will undo much of what they accomplished today. Elsewhere, a pair of privates fill sandbags in a shallow pit. The sand is damp, heavy, and difficult to maneuver. They lift each bag with slow precision, tying it off before passing it to another team reinforcing the trench wall. The bags pile up, one layer at a time, forming a barrier that feels both essential and oddly fragile. The men know the truth. One well-placed shell can undo hours of effort, turning their careful labor into scattered debris in seconds. Near a support dugout, a corporal leads a repair crew fixing a collapsed firing step. They haul timber planks from a nearby stack, their breaths forming short clouds as they work. Hammers strike wood with muted thuds. Nails are driven in at angles learned through repetition rather than instruction. The corporal kneels, checking the alignment, adjusting a support beam with the palm of his hand. The rhythm of construction is steady, almost soothing. Not enjoyable. Nothing here is, but predictable. A mule team arrives with fresh supplies. The animals' hooves squelch softly in the mud, their breath rising in white curls. The driver leads them with quiet murmurs, patting one mule on the neck as it hesitates near a narrow bend. The arrival of supplies always brings a slight stir of interest. Not because anything is luxurious. The crates hold rations, tools, and replacement boards, but because movement breaks the monotony. Even the slow, labored gait of a mule feels like a shift in the day's rhythm. One soldier unloads a crate of entrenching tools and pauses for a moment, stretching his back. His uniform is streaked with dried clay. His hands bear small cuts that sting in the cold air. He wipes them absently on his trousers before lifting another crate. The gesture is automatic, a sign of how accustomed the men have become to the dull ache that never leaves their limbs. At midday, the work continues with barely a pause. A few men gather near a brazier to warm their hands, the flame flickering weakly. They lift mugs of tea to their lips, savoring the brief heat before returning to their tasks. A private stirs the coals with a stick, watching sparks climb before fading. His face is impassive, but his movements reveal fatigue that has settled deep into his muscles. By early afternoon, the trench has changed in subtle ways. The walls stand straighter. The drainage flows more freely. Duckboards sit more evenly. Yet the improvements are modest, temporary victories against a landscape that constantly seeks to reclaim its shape. The men understand this. None expect their work to last. What matters is keeping the trench functional long enough to endure another rotation. A sergeant inspects the completed repairs, nodding at intervals. He stops at a section near the trench corner where a support beam sags slightly. Two soldiers join him, adjusting the beam until it settles into place. The sergeant gives a quiet word of approval before moving on. His presence is steadying. He does not offer praise often, but his small acknowledgments carry weight. Throughout the day, the mud remains a constant adversary. It grips boots, swallows tools, and adds resistance to every movement. It is thick in some places, slick in others, deceptively stable before giving way underfoot. Soldiers curse it quietly, though without malice. The mud is not an enemy to defeat. It is a condition to endure. As the afternoon wanes, the work details begin to dissolve. Men return tools to their storage areas, wipe mud from their hands, and settle along the trench wall for a brief rest. Their shoulders sag, their breaths slow. A private sits on a crate, removing a stone that has lodged itself inside his boot. He examines it, flicks it aside, and then pulls his laces tight again. Another man leans back, eyes half closed, listening to the distant, rhythmic thud of artillery from farther south. The repairs completed today will hold through the night, perhaps through the next rain. The men know they will be asked to repeat these tasks again and again, each cycle blending into the next. There is no final version of the trench, no finished state. Only temporary stability, preserved through constant effort. This is the work that never ends, essential, repetitive, and quietly exhausting. A world held together by hands that rarely rest and by routines that demand more patience than strength. Behind the drama of offensives and bombardments, trench warfare survived on the kind of labor that rarely appears in official histories. The reserve trenches, though safer than the front line, demanded an unbroken commitment to maintenance. Without constant attention, they would collapse under the pressure of rain, shifting soil, and daily use. This work became one of the defining features of life in the Ypres salient. Historically, soldiers were expected to spend large portions of their time repairing the very structures meant to protect them. The geography of Ypres made this even more essential. The salient sat on low, wet ground, where drainage was poor and shellfire easily turned soil into thick, clinging mud. Duckboards shifted or broke under weight, trench walls sagged after rain, and sandbags decayed quickly in the damp climate. Nothing held its shape for long, and everything required reinforcement. This environment shaped a routine that was as exhausting as combat in its own way. Men dug new drainage channels, hauled sandbags, rebuilt parapets, and reinforced dugouts. These tasks rarely offered a sense of accomplishment. A week of heavy rain could undo days of careful work. A single shell could destroy a section rebuilt only hours before. Soldiers understood the futility of this cycle, yet they performed their duties with steady patience because the alternative, a trench collapse during an emergency, could be deadly. The British Army relied heavily on this daily labor. Manuals and orders emphasized maintenance as a vital component of trench life. Officers and non-commissioned officers supervised with vigilance, knowing that slack routines could lead to sudden disasters. The culture of the trenches was one of constant vigilance, even when the threat came not from the enemy, but from the environment itself. Repetition shaped morale in complex ways. On one hand, predictable work routines provided structure. Soldiers often found comfort in tasks that required simple, steady effort. Shoveling, filling sandbags, and hammering boards allowed the mind to drift without becoming overwhelmed. These tasks created a rhythm that helped counterbalance the anxiety of waiting for the next rotation forward. On the other hand, the monotony could wear down enthusiasm. Men sometimes felt trapped in an endless loop, performing the same duties day after day without tangible progress. Letters from home reflect this frustration. Soldiers wrote about the draining nature of fatigue duty, about mud that swallowed boots and tools, and about the feeling that they were fighting the landscape as much as the enemy. Yet the routine also kept them focused, offering a manageable challenge when the larger war felt impossibly vast. The work required physical endurance. Tools were heavy, mud resisted every movement, and cold weather tightened joints and numbed fingers. Even young soldiers grew noticeably weary after weeks of such labor. Still, there was a quiet pride in maintaining the line. A well-built trench offered safety. A reinforced parapet could stop shrapnel. A functioning drainage ditch could prevent flooding that might cost lives. These practical results gave meaning to otherwise repetitive tasks. Camaraderie also formed in these moments. Men assigned to the same work detail often developed a shared rhythm, communicating through gestures rather than words. Passing sandbags down a line or digging in coordinated movements created patterns of cooperation that strengthened group cohesion. These small, physical acts of teamwork became essential to the morale of infantry battalions. The Ypres salient demanded more maintenance than many other sectors precisely because of its strategic importance. Any weakening of the trenches risked creating vulnerabilities the enemy could exploit. Commanders understood this, but the soldiers felt it most acutely. They were the ones who labored through the cold, the mud, and the fatigue to keep the line intact. Their daily efforts were a form of endurance often overlooked, a quieter, slower form of bravery. You observe how this unending labor shaped the men as deeply as any battle. The repetition taught them patience and resignation. The physical strain forged resilience. The shared effort strengthened bonds among comrades. And the knowledge that their work sustained the battalion, even if only temporarily, gave them purpose in a landscape where purpose often felt elusive. In Ypres, survival depended not only on courage under fire, but on the steady, unremarkable work of maintenance. This was the war behind the war, the hands that held the line together, one board, one sandbag, one shovel of mud at a time. Orders that take their time. The day settles into its slow rhythm long before the men realize it. Work details taper off, tools are stowed, and a fragile stillness spreads through the reserve trench. It is not peace. It is not rest. It is the quiet that comes when men know something may change soon, but do not know when. You observe how the trench holds itself in a suspended state. A few soldiers sit on overturned crates, cleaning mud from their boots with the tips of their knives. Others rest against the wall, helmets tilted forward to shield their eyes from the pale afternoon light. The mood is subdued, but not weary in the usual sense. It carries a different tension, the tension of waiting for orders that have not yet arrived. A corporal checks his watch for the third time in 10 minutes, though he does not expect anything precise. The battalion knows a rotation is coming. They feel it in the small signals, the sergeants exchanging quiet words, the lieutenants scanning the trench as if measuring its readiness, the slight shift in how men pack their kits. But no one knows the hour. The uncertainty sits like a weight across the shoulders, an invisible pressure that tightens with each passing minute. Near a dugout entrance, two soldiers share a stale piece of bread, tearing it silently. One shrugs, offering half to the other without ceremony. Hunger is not the issue. Ration timing is predictable. It is simply something to do, a small gesture that fills the space between thoughts. A third soldier watches them for a moment, then returns to adjusting the straps on his haversack. He pulls them, tests them, pulls again, as if the act itself can steady him. A runner passes through the trench, his boots splashing lightly on the damp boards. He moves quickly, and conversations pause as he goes by. The men glance after him, not with hope, but with curiosity. Was he carrying orders? Was he simply delivering a routine message? In the reserve line, even the smallest sign of urgency sends ripples through the trench. The runner disappears around a bend, leaving no answers behind. A sergeant approaches a group of soldiers resting near a stack of sandbags. His voice is calm, almost gentle. "Stay close," he says. Not an order, not a warning, just a reminder. The men nod and shift slightly, tightening their packs, adjusting their rifles. They do not stand. They do not gather. They simply become more alert, like animals sensing a change in the weather. Above the trench, clouds gather in slow, deliberate layers. The air grows heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic. A distant battery fires a brief series of test rounds, their echoes rolling across the landscape. The sound is not close enough to cause alarm, but it is close enough to remind the men that movement could come at any moment. The line always pulls them forward eventually. A private sits alone, tracing the outline of a faded photograph tucked into his paybook. He does not smile. He does not sigh. He simply looks, as though memorizing each detail in case he needs to store it away for a while. When he finishes, he folds the paybook carefully and places it inside his tunic, pressing it flat with his palm. Time stretches. Afternoon becomes something more indistinct, not exactly evening but drifting toward it. The trench seems to exhale and hold its breath in the same motion. A lieutenant emerges from the command dugout, his expression thoughtful. He carries a map under his arm, and the men straighten instinctively as he passes. But he offers no words, only a small nod. He moves along the walkway, boots leaving shallow prints in the damp earth. The men watch him until he disappears behind another corner. His presence tells them enough. Decisions are being made, but not yet delivered. In the quiet that follows, a few soldiers light cigarettes. The embers glow faintly, small points of color in the muted air. Smoke drifts upward, merging with the low clouds. One man taps ash into the mud, his fingers trembling slightly. Fatigue does not cause the tremor. Waiting does. A logbook rests open on a crate near the trench junction. A non-commissioned officer writes notes, supply tallies, personnel counts, routine entries meant for higher command. His handwriting is steady, but he pauses often, listening for footsteps or distant calls. Even paperwork feels temporary today, overshadowed by the sense that new instructions are approaching. Toward late afternoon, a distant murmur travels through the trench. 2 voices, then a few more, then silence again. Rumors form easily in the reserve line, but this one does not fully take shape. The men know better than to speculate. They have learned that certainty comes only when the officer stands before them with orders in hand. Until then, talk changes nothing. Still, the atmosphere shifts, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Packs are checked again. Rifles are cradled a little closer. Postures straighten. The waiting grows heavier, filling the trench like a rising tide. A faint drizzle begins to fall, soft enough that some men barely notice it at first. It gathers on helmets, darkens greatcoats, and beads along the wooden planks. The trench absorbs it, becoming slick and colder. A private lifts his face toward the sky, expression unreadable. Rain often signals a delay, but not always. Sometimes it means the rotation will be harder. As evening finally settles, the trench glows with a few dim lanterns. Men sit quietly, conserving their strength, their breaths forming thin white trails in the cooling air. No one asks when the orders will arrive. They simply wait, steadied by ritual, burdened by uncertainty. And somewhere beyond the bend in the trench, footsteps echo, slow, deliberate, approaching. Not yet the signal to move, but close. The uncertainty that hung over the reserve trenches at Ypres was not incidental. It was built into the structure of trench warfare. Orders rarely arrived with clarity or punctuality. Instead, they moved through layers of command, were adjusted according to shifting conditions, and often reached the men only after hours of waiting. This waiting was not a pause in the war. It was part of the war's rhythm. Historically, battalions in the British Expeditionary Force operated on rotation schedules meant to maintain cohesion and spread out the psychological burden of the front. A unit would move from reserve to support, then into the firing line, and eventually back out again. But these movements depended on weather, artillery activity, enemy behavior, and logistics. A sudden barrage could delay a shift. A gap in the line could accelerate it. Even the availability of working mule teams could affect timing. For the soldiers in the reserve trenches, this meant that knowing a rotation was coming did not equate to knowing when it would begin. The anticipation wore at men differently than the front-line danger. In the firing line, decisions were often immediate. Instincts and training guided the moment. But in reserve, thought had too much room to roam. Men wondered whether the next hours would bring rest or movement, safety or strain. This uncertainty created a tension that settled into the body, tightening muscles, shortening tempers, and heightening awareness of every passing minute. The British command understood the value of keeping soldiers informed, but the reality of the Western Front made consistent communication difficult. Messages traveled through runners who navigated trenches crowded with supplies, wounded men, and working parties. Telephone lines were fragile and often disrupted by shell fire or flooding. Rumors filled the gaps. A passing runner, a lieutenant with a map, or a sergeant checking equipment could all become signals that orders were near, even when they were not. Within this ambiguity, routine became an anchor. Soldiers filled the waiting hours by cleaning equipment, repairing gear, and performing small rituals that helped maintain discipline. These activities kept minds focused, but they also inadvertently reinforced the sense of impending change. A polished rifle, a neatly packed kit, a tightened strap, each action signaled readiness for movement that might come at any moment. Emotionally, the waiting affected new recruits and veterans differently. Younger soldiers often experienced a restless anxiety, glancing frequently toward officers and reacting sharply to sudden noises. Men who had endured multiple rotations developed a quieter resignation. They understood that orders would come when they came, and worrying would not hasten them. Yet even seasoned soldiers were not immune to the strain. Long periods of anticipation could fray nerves as effectively as combat. The Ypres salient amplified this uncertainty. Its shape, a bulge into enemy territory, meant that units were vulnerable on multiple sides. A decision to rotate might be delayed by shelling from the east, only to be complicated moments later by an observation balloon spotted to the north. The geography made planning more unpredictable than in more stable sectors. Soldiers in reserve knew this, even if they did not articulate it. They felt the instability in the air, sensed it in the behavior of their officers, recognized it in the subtle shifts of posture among the NCOs. This constant readiness shaped the culture of the trench. A sergeant's quiet, "Stay close," carried more emotional weight than a shouted order. A lieutenant walking the line with a folded map became a symbol of both authority and uncertainty. The arrival or passing of a runner could change the entire mood of a section, even before anyone knew what the message contained. Still, the men adapted. Humans learn to live within uncertainty when routine becomes the stabilizing force. Tea boiled. Equipment checked. Small jokes traded in low tones. Each action stitched together the long stretch of waiting. In these moments, camaraderie deepened. Soldiers trusted one another to share news, to read signs, to interpret silence. You observe how this anticipation became its own kind of endurance. The men learned to carry the weight of time, to hold themselves in the narrow space between rest and action. In doing so, they developed a form of resilience not tied to heroics or battles, but to patience, an often overlooked kind of strength shaped by the slow pulse of trench life. When orders finally arrived, they rarely came with drama. A quiet word from an officer, a nod from a sergeant, a simple instruction, "Prepare to move." After hours of tension, the moment of decision felt almost anticlimactic. Yet it triggered a shift through the trench, men gathering their kits, extinguishing braziers, tightening straps, forming into columns. The waiting ended not with relief, but with movement. Another cycle beginning. When the trench begins to move. Evening settles into the reserve line as a muted gradient of grey and fading blue. Lanterns flicker along narrow walkways, casting trembling shadows across damp walls. Men move quietly now, their gestures small, deliberate. Packs are slung, rifles checked, greatcoats tightened. The moment they have been waiting for and dreading arrives not with a shout or sudden urgency, but with a quiet message passed from one section to the next. Stand by to move. You observe how the air changes before the men do. A subtle shift, like the pressure dropping before a storm. Boots scrape softly along duckboards. A sergeant walks the line with slow steps, offering nods rather than words. The officers speak in low tones, checking lists, ensuring no man or piece of equipment has been left behind. Routine smooths the edges of uncertainty, but the men feel the pull of the front like a distant, insistent current. A private tightens the strap of his haversack one final time. His hands move with practiced efficiency, but there is a slight tremor in his fingers. Not fear exactly, more the body's acknowledgement of what lies ahead. Another soldier adjusts the position of his entrenching tool, sliding it until it sits more comfortably against his hip. These small corrections signal readiness, but also an attempt to find comfort where little exists. Near a dugout entrance, a corporal extinguishes a small brazier. The glow fades, leaving only the smell of faintly burned wood. Men standing nearby watch as the last ember dies. They know that once the column forms, warmth will become a memory, replaced by the steady rhythm of marching through mud-darkened trenches toward the support line. A quiet call moves down the trench. Form up. There is no rush, no panic. Men rise, gather their kits, and take their places. They fall into line with the familiarity of ritual, each man stepping into a position he has occupied countless times before. Helmets tilt forward. Breath clouds the cool air. Shoulder straps creak as weight settles into place. The column begins to move, one slow step at a time. Boots press into the boards with a muffled, rhythmic thud. The trench narrows slightly, forcing the men into an even tighter formation. The walls seem closer at night, the darkness heavier. A few lanterns remain lit, guiding the way, but shadows dominate the path. Movement in dim light demands attention. Each step must be measured, each turn anticipated. The trench bends left, then right, following the irregular lines cut by engineers months or years earlier. Sandbags loom in uneven stacks. A collapsed portion has been recently reinforced. Men step carefully across the fresh timber, testing its hold with their weight. A sergeant murmurs, "Mind the boards," though the men already know. As they advance, the reserve line slowly gives way to communication trenches, narrower, steeper, more twisting. The sounds change here. The men's boots make sharper contact with the boards. The air cools further, carrying the distant, intermittent rumble of artillery from the front. The rumble is not continuous, but each thud carries through the ground with a faint vibration that travels up the legs. A private glances upward at the thin line of sky visible between the sandbags. It appears pale, threaded with unsteady light as lanterns flicker below. The movement of the column creates a soft, collective sound. Breathing, cloth brushing cloth, metal tapping against gear. There is no conversation. Words feel out of place in this transition, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile boundary between here and what awaits ahead. The trench widens briefly, allowing the men to adjust their positions. A mule team passes in the opposite direction, guided by a tired driver. The animals step reluctantly, hooves slipping slightly in the mud. Their packs clink softly. The men shift aside to let them through, pressing against the trench walls as the animals squeeze past. Once they have passed, the column reforms without instruction. A lieutenant stands at the intersection, map case strapped against his side. He steps aside to let the men move past him, giving each a brief, steady glance. His presence reassures them in ways no command could. A silent acknowledgement that he will be there ahead, waiting. As the march continues, the air becomes thicker, carrying the scent of cordite from batteries farther forward. A persistent hum seems to settle around the column, not sound exactly, but the awareness of proximity to the line. Even in darkness, the men sense the shift, the ground slightly more uneven, the trench walls darker with soot, the occasional piece of shrapnel embedded in the timbers. They pause briefly at a junction, waiting for the next section of the trench to clear. The stop is short, but in the silence, time elongates. A man shifts his weight, rolling his shoulders beneath his pack. Another tightens his chin strap. A third looks down at the mud beneath his boots, studying the small ripples formed by earlier footsteps. They listen for signals, for movement ahead, for anything that might explain the delay. A call comes through softly. Move on. They step forward again. The communication trench gives way to a darker, narrower path leading toward the support line. Here, the walls rise higher. The boards are more worn. Lanterns hang farther apart, leaving stretches of near-total darkness that the men cross with cautious steps. Somewhere in the near distance, a shell lands with a dull, heavy thump. Not close enough to alarm, but close enough to remind them of where they are heading. The march continues in measured silence. Boots, breath, the faint creak of gear. The sound of men moving in unison through a landscape that has shaped them more deeply than they ever expected. This is the moment between states, no longer waiting, not yet fighting. A transition carried out step by step, in the dark, under the weight of knowledge the men rarely name aloud. The trench begins to open ahead, widening as it merges with the support line. Movement slows. The column gathers. Orders wait just beyond the next bend. And the men keep walking. The movement from the reserve line toward the support trenches was one of the most psychologically charged transitions in the Ypres salient. Soldiers understood that each step forward brought them closer to the danger they had only recently left behind. The shift was not dramatic. No sudden rush, no shouted commands, but it was profound. It marked the moment when routine gave way to readiness. Historically, these movements were carefully timed. Battalions did not simply march forward at will. Their advance depended on the state of the trenches ahead, the timing of other units rotating out, and the coordination of supply lines. A delay of even 30 minutes could create congestion in narrow walkways, slowing critical movement or leaving men exposed in open sections. Officers and NCOs managed these transitions with precision, but from the soldier's perspective, the hours leading up to movement felt uncertain. They might be told to stand by long before actual orders arrived. When the message finally came, it traveled quietly through the ranks, a soft instruction passed from man to man. This was deliberate. Silence reduced confusion and prevented unnecessary attention from the enemy. Even in reserve areas, sound discipline mattered. German listening posts, placed at strategic points, could detect careless noise and direct artillery accordingly. Therefore, the column moved in near silence, a line of men becoming shadows within the trench. The physical act of moving toward the front was shaped by the trench system itself. Communication trenches were narrow, twisting pathways, often reinforced only loosely with timber. In Ypres, these trenches had to follow the contours of the low-lying ground, weaving around waterlogged hollows and shell-damaged areas. Soldiers marched single file, adjusting to the uneven footing, ducking beneath low beams, and stepping across makeshift repairs. A slip or misstep could break the rhythm of an entire column. Psychologically, the march carried a sense of inevitability. Even though the reserve line was relatively safer, it was not safety in any meaningful sense. Soldiers knew they had only borrowed time there. Moving forward meant relinquishing that fragile buffer. Veterans of the salient often described this march as the moment when thoughts grew quiet, not out of calm, but out of resignation and focus. The mind narrowed to the rhythm of boots, the weight of equipment, and the faint sounds drifting from the front. Signs of proximity became impossible to ignore. The smell of cordite from distant batteries, the darkened timbers scarred by shrapnel, the echo of gunfire carried on the wind. These sensory cues created a gradual shift in mindset. Even if the men could not see the front, they felt it in the vibration of distant impacts and the tightening of their own shoulders. Mule teams, essential for transporting ammunition and supplies, often moved against the flow of infantry columns. These encounters disrupted the march briefly, forcing men to press against the trench walls to let the animals pass. The cramped space and unpredictable movements of the mules added to the tension. Yet these moments also reminded soldiers of the logistical machinery supporting them, a silent reassurance that they were not advancing alone. During short halts, the trench atmosphere grew thick with unspoken questions. Why had they stopped? Was something wrong ahead? Was the line too crowded, too damaged, too dangerous? Experienced NCOs managed these pauses with calm efficiency, preventing anxiety from spreading through the column. They offered brief gestures, a nod, a steady glance, that helped the men maintain focus. Historically, the Ypres salient was notorious for the unpredictability of these movements. Heavy shelling could collapse communication trenches, forcing sudden reroutes. Flooding could turn pathways into knee-deep channels of mud. Night marches might be illuminated unexpectedly by flares or interrupted by stray rounds. Even without direct engagement, the journey toward the front carried risks that demanded vigilance. Yet the march was also a reminder of the discipline that defined trench warfare. Units trained to move with minimal sound, to follow the man ahead without hesitation, and to adjust seamlessly to changes in pace. These routines allowed battalions to function as cohesive groups, even under strain. The quiet strength of these movements lay not in urgency, but in steadiness. Camaraderie played a subtle but vital role. Soldiers often recognized the gait or silhouette of the man in front of them, taking comfort in familiarity. A shared glance during a halt or the simple awareness of a comrade's presence helped ease the tension of the dark, narrow pathways. Trust, built during long periods of waiting, working, and enduring, carried the men forward just as much as discipline. You observe how this transition marked a return to the deeper, harsher rhythm of the war. The reserve line had offered routine and predictability, but the march toward the support trenches restored the sense of uncertainty that defined life at the front. It was a shift felt in breath, in muscle, in silence. When the column reached the support line, the men were not yet in immediate danger, but they had crossed an invisible threshold. The world behind them, the relative stillness of the reserve trenches, faded. Ahead lay the unpredictable, grinding reality of the firing line. Another cycle continued. The edge of the front. The support line receives the men with a different kind of silence, not the stillness of reserve, but the tight, held-breath quiet of a place that lives just behind danger. The trench here feels narrower, the walls darker, the earth more compacted by years of reinforcement. Lanterns hang lower, their light dimmed intentionally to avoid drawing attention from forward observers. The men file in without comment, settling into positions that feel both temporary and heavy with expectation. You observe the shift in their posture the moment they arrive. Shoulders tighten. Movements become more measured. The air carries a faint vibration from artillery working somewhere ahead, the kind that travels through the ground before the ears register it. The support line is the gateway to the front, close enough that sound and pressure merge into one constant hum. A sergeant guides the column through a narrow junction, directing each section to its assigned area. His voice stays low but firm, the cadence steady. The men glance around as they pass. A collapsed firing step replaced by a rough scaffold of timber and sandbags, a dugout entrance reinforced with corrugated iron, a stack of ammunition boxes arranged neatly beside a junction where the walkway splits in two. Every shape looks sharper here, every shadow deeper. A private kneels to check the laces on his boots. His fingers move quickly, as though the simple act can settle something in him. Another soldier leans his rifle against the wall and wipes condensation from the stock with the corner of his sleeve. These small gestures do not prepare them for battle, but they prepare them for waiting, the particular kind of waiting that defines the support line. The trench floor is wetter here. Water seeps from the walls, pooling in shallow depressions that cannot be fully drained. Duckboards creak as men shift their weight. The smell is stronger. Damp earth, cold metal, smoke from distant guns, the faint sourness of old sandbags dissolving in the moisture. The atmosphere is neither chaotic nor calm. It is suspended, stretched thin. A communication runner arrives from the front, his uniform streaked with mud. He speaks briefly with the lieutenant, then continues his path without slowing. The men notice the look in the runner's eyes, alert, focused, carrying news that moves faster than words. They read the signs. Whatever lies ahead is active. A distant flare rises above the front line, painting the sky in a pallid glow before fading. The men look up briefly, acknowledging the signal without reacting further. Flares are a constant presence near Ypres, illumination for patrols, warnings of movement, sometimes simply a way for both sides to see the ground between them. Still, each flare is a reminder that the front is not far. Inside a dugout, a small group gathers to unpack ammunition crates. The process is familiar, almost methodical. A corporal opens the lid with the end of his trench knife, revealing rows of clipped rounds. Another soldier counts them aloud in a low voice. They place the boxes carefully along a shelf carved from the wall. Dust rises as they work, floating briefly in the lantern light before settling again. Elsewhere, two privates sit on a narrow bench, checking gas masks. They remove the masks from their satchels, inspect the valves, and test the straps. They perform these steps slowly, repeatedly, as if repetition itself can steady their nerves. A sergeant passes, glances at their work, and nods. In the support line, readiness is not about speed, it is about precision. Further along, a cook stirs a pot of thin stew over a small spirit burner. The smell spreads through the trench, incongruous with the tension in the air. A few men drift closer, drawn by the warmth. Bowls are ladled out in quiet rhythm. The food tastes faintly of smoked meat and onions, diluted by too much water, but it fills the stomach. The men eat without conversation, their eyes drifting toward the forward trench, as though expecting orders to arrive mid-bite. From the front, a volley of machine-gun fire rattles through the evening. The trench absorbs the sound like a struck drum. No one flinches, not out of bravery, but because they have learned to interpret sound. That pattern does not signal an attack. It is suppressive fire, routine, directed at shadows and suspected movement. Still, it settles into the men's chests, a reminder of where they will be soon. A few soldiers gather near a junction where a narrow sap leads toward the firing line. They peer into the darkness, but see little beyond the first few beams of the duckboards. The sap is too tight for comfort, with walls close enough to brush shoulders. A corporal steps forward, checking the timbers along the entrance, tapping one with his knuckles to test its integrity. The wood sounds solid. He steps back, satisfied. Night deepens. The support line becomes a corridor of muted sound. Boots shuffling, distant bursts of fire, the low murmur of officers coordinating the next rotation. The men sit on their packs, adjusting straps, stretching their fingers, resting their heads against the trench wall. They do not sleep. Sleep belongs to other parts of the line. A private pulls a small notebook from his tunic, flips through a few pages, and stops. He holds a pencil poised above the paper, but writes nothing. After a moment, he closes the notebook and returns it to his pocket. Words feel too heavy to set down here. A flare rises again, casting thin shadows along the trench. The men's faces briefly illuminate, tired, focused, resigned. The light fades, and the trench returns to darkness. This is the edge of the front, the place where waiting tightens into readiness, where the hum of distant artillery becomes a constant companion, and where each man feels the pull of what lies just beyond the sap. Orders are close, and when they arrive, the men will step forward once more, into the place where the night is louder and the ground trembles. The support line occupied an unusual position in the geography and psychology of the Ypres salient. It was close enough to the firing line to feel the vibration of shells, but far enough to avoid the immediate chaos of combat. This distance, narrow yet significant, created a space defined by tension rather than action. For many soldiers, the support trenches were where anticipation pressed hardest. Historically, the support line served multiple purposes. It provided reinforcement for the front, stored supplies, sheltered reserve platoons, and acted as a staging area for patrols and carrying parties. Ammunition, tools, water, and rations were often stockpiled here in case the front line was cut off. This made the support trenches essential to sustaining any position in the salient. Yet their logistical importance did little to ease the strain on the men who occupied them. The proximity to the firing line meant that the sounds of battle were constant. Machine guns rattled intermittently. Artillery boomed at irregular intervals. Night patrols triggered flares that cast pale, temporary daylight over the land between trenches. Soldiers learned to interpret these signals: the sharp crack of a rifle, the slower pound of a distant battery, the short chatter of a machine gun testing its aim. Even without direct engagement, the noise shaped the mood of the support trenches. Men listened not out of curiosity, but because their survival depended on understanding the rhythm of the front. This environment demanded a constant readiness. Soldiers cleaned rifles, tested gas masks, and maintained equipment with care not required in the reserve trenches. Any lapse could be dangerous if the support line was suddenly targeted. A nearby barrage might collapse walls, cut communication lines, or force sections of the battalion to move forward unexpectedly. The line was stable only in theory. In practice, it required continual attention. Communication runners played a vital role in the support trenches. Their movements carried information from the front to the reserve and back again. Runners were trained to navigate complex trench networks, often in poor visibility, under the threat of sudden shelling. Soldiers in the support line frequently watched these messengers for clues about what lay ahead. A runner moving quickly, his uniform muddied and torn, often signaled trouble. One moving calmly and without urgency suggested that conditions remained controlled. Fatigue also took a distinct shape in the support line. Unlike the reserve trenches, where men sometimes had opportunities for limited rest, the support positions demanded alertness. Sleep, when possible, came in short, uneasy stretches. Dugouts here were often deeper and better reinforced, but the constant noise made true rest difficult. Soldiers described waking repeatedly to the tremor of nearby explosions or the distant echo of shouts from the front. Despite this tension, the support line was not purely a place of fear. It was also a place of connection. Soldiers shared narrow benches, passed food, repaired gear together, and relied on one another's presence to steady their nerves. These small interactions fostered camaraderie in a way that felt different from the reserve trenches. Here, bonds formed not through tasks repeated every day, but through the shared awareness of what lay just ahead. The psychological weight of the support line came from its role as a threshold. Men knew they were one order away from moving into the firing line. The uncertainty of when that shift would occur heightened their senses. A lieutenant passing with a folded map, a sergeant adjusting his gear, a sudden flurry of activity near a junction. Any of these signs could signal the beginning of a new rotation. Veterans learned to read these moments with quiet accuracy, even when commanding officers remained cautious with information. The geography of Ypres further complicated the support trenches. The salient's shape meant that enemy observation posts could watch over certain rear areas, turning supposedly safer positions into vulnerable ones. Artillery barrages occasionally targeted support trenches precisely because they served as lifelines to the front. A single shell might disrupt ammunition stores or block access routes, forcing dangerous repair efforts under fire. Yet through these difficulties, the support line functioned as the connective tissue of the entire defensive system. It linked the relative safety of the reserve with the harsh demands of the front. It housed the tools, supplies, and personnel that made sustained defense possible. Soldiers understood this role intuitively. They recognized that although the support line lacked the drama of direct engagement, it demanded its own form of endurance, quiet vigilance, patience, and resilience. You observe how the support line sits at the fragile boundary between rest and battle. It is a place defined by transition, where men prepare themselves mentally for the next step. The atmosphere here shapes them deeply. It teaches them to carry tension without allowing it to break them, to wait without losing focus, to move when called without hesitation. In the Ypres salient, courage was not only measured in attacks or defenses. It was measured in the quiet moments when men held themselves steady in the support trenches, listening to the hum of the guns and knowing they would soon step forward into the line where the earth trembled. Where the line holds its breath. The firing line emerges from the dark like a shape half-carved from the earth. It does not announce itself. It simply appears, a narrowing of the trench, a thickening of the walls, the presence of men who move with quiet purpose. The column filters into position with the subdued discipline of soldiers who know the ground too well to rush. There is no confusion, no wasted motion. Each man steps into the space allocated to him, settling into a position that is both familiar and unwelcome. You observe how the air changes the moment they cross the final junction. It becomes sharper, colder, carrying the metallic taste of recent gunfire. The walls bear scars, splintered timber, torn sandbags, darkened patches where shrapnel tore through. Everything here looks worn but fiercely tended, the result of countless hands laboring under strain to keep the trench intact. The men move without speaking. A private lowers himself onto a firing step, checking the alignment of his rifle against the parapet. Another adjusts a loophole cover, ensuring it swings smoothly. A corporal kneels beside a stack of ammunition boxes, opening one and examining the contents with a quick, practiced glance. These tasks are not frantic. They are measured, precise. Survival in the firing line depends on quiet preparation, not haste. A gust of wind passes over the trench, carrying the faint smell of cordite and the damp odor of churned earth. Beyond the parapet lies a stretch of darkness punctuated occasionally by distant flares. No man looks over the top longer than necessary. The line between observation and exposure is thin here, nearly invisible. A few inches of hesitation or carelessness can lead to an instant no one has time to register. In a shallow recess along the trench wall, a young private covers a small flame with cupped hands as he lights a cigarette. The glow illuminates his face for just a moment, pale, drawn, eyes rimmed with fatigue. He exhales slowly, letting the smoke drift along the trench before the breeze takes it away. Another soldier gives him a brief look, neither approval nor reprimand. Small comforts survive even here, though they take on an edge of necessity rather than indulgence. A faint thud rolls across the ground, distant artillery. The men pause, listening. It is not incoming. The sound does not deepen, does not accelerate into the rhythm they know too well. Still, it hangs in the air, leaving a residue of tension that settles into the muscles of every man present. Even when nothing is directed toward them, the firing line hums with the potential for sudden violence. An NCO moves quietly along the line, checking positions. He speaks in low murmurs, "Keep the parapet clear, watch that gap, check that drain." His tone is calm but firm. He steps around puddles, duckboards creaking beneath his weight. A lantern sways as he passes, casting long shadows across the trench. The men respond with small gestures, a nod, the tightening of a strap, a quick adjustment of gear. These actions become a language of their own. Farther along, a shallow dugout holds a few soldiers resting against the walls. They are not sleeping. Sleep rarely arrives in the firing line unless forced by exhaustion. Instead, they sit with eyes half closed, conserving strength. Every few minutes, one of them shifts, stretching cramped legs or adjusting the position of his rifle. The dugout is narrow, its ceiling low, the air thick with humidity. A single lantern flickers above them, its flame trembling with each draft. Outside, the trench narrows further near a junction where a sap leads toward a forward-listening post. A corporal stands at the entrance, speaking quietly with a pair of men scheduled for the night detail. Their faces are expressionless, but their hands move with purposeful care as they check equipment. Wire cutters, grenades, a small signal lamp. They disappear into the sap with steady, practiced steps, slipping into a darkness that swallows them immediately. The rest of the line remains still for a long moment. The absence of activity weighs heavily. When listening posts are manned, the line behaves differently, quieter, more attentive, as though the trench itself is holding its breath. A flare rises in the distance, casting a harsh white glow over the shattered landscape. The light reflects off puddles, glints off exposed metal, momentarily revealing the outlines of twisted trees and broken earth. Shadows stretch across the trench floor, sharp and distorted. When the flare dies, the darkness returns heavier than before. A few men shift uneasily, the sudden contrast unsettling. One adjusts his helmet strap. Another wipes condensation from his rifle sight. The firing line often magnifies small gestures, turning ordinary movements into signs read by those nearby. Fear is rarely voiced aloud, but it lives in these details. The tightening of a jaw, the tapping of fingers against a rifle stock, the brief, almost unnoticeable pause before stepping onto a firing step. The night deepens. The guns remain quiet, save for the occasional distant exchange. No attack comes. No barrage opens. Yet the tension does not ease. This is the peculiar nature of the firing line. Danger may be imminent or distant, but the uncertainty itself becomes a constant presence. Men do not wait for something specific. They wait for the moment when waiting ends. A private sitting on the firing step glances toward the lieutenant, who stands near a junction reviewing a map under a hooded lantern. The young officer traces a line with his finger, nodding to himself. His calm steadiness spreads subtly through the men nearby. Even small signs of composure carry weight here. A faint rustle travels along the parapet, a shift in the wind, perhaps, or the settling of sandbags. Several soldiers look up instinctively, hands moving toward rifles. The moment passes. They return to their positions, breaths shallow but steady. This is the front line in one of its most common forms, not under bombardment, not locked in combat, but simply holding, alert, tense, tired, while the ground ahead lies silent. The line waits. The men wait. And the night stretches on with the quiet, relentless weight only Ypres can summon. The firing line in the Ypres salient was a place defined less by constant combat and more by the unbroken tension of possible combat. Modern portrayals of trench warfare often imagine uninterrupted barrages and daily assaults, but the reality, especially in sectors like Ypres, was more complicated. Violence came in waves. In between, there were long stretches where the line simply waited, held, and listened. This waiting was not passive. It was its own form of vigilance, shaped by the close proximity of enemy lines and the geography of the salient. The British trenches often sat only a few dozen meters from their German counterparts. In certain areas, a man speaking too loudly could be heard across the lines. Patrols moved silently through saps and listening posts, and every sound, every shift of earth, every creak of timber, could hold meaning. Historically, holding the line required discipline and attentiveness. Soldiers monitored the parapet for signs of tunneling, enemy snipers, and movement under cover of darkness. Listening posts extended into the shattered ground between trenches, relying on trained sensors to detect disturbances. This system of observation and response created the constant hum of awareness that defined life in the front trenches. Even when the guns fell silent, the work never stopped. The firing line at Ypres was reinforced after every attack. Repairs had to be made quickly and quietly, sandbags repositioned, firing steps rebuilt, parapets strengthened with timber. This labor often occurred under the threat of sudden bombardment or sniper fire. The front line changed shape regularly, eroded by weather and shell fire, so that every day felt like tending to something fragile and unstable. Soldiers understood that their survival depended on the trench staying intact. Psychologically, the firing line exerted a unique pressure on the mind. Unlike the reserve or support trenches, where tasks offered distraction, the front forced men into stillness. Here, thought became sharper, heavier. Men worried about gas alarms, bombardments, or night raids. They monitored the sky for flares, tracked vibrations in the earth, listened for the unnatural quiet that sometimes signaled an imminent attack. Fatigue mixed with hyper-awareness, creating a mental strain that was difficult to escape. Veterans developed coping mechanisms for this environment. Some found solace in small tasks, adjusting equipment, cleaning a rifle, organizing ammunition. Others watched the horizon, grounding themselves in routine observation. Many simply embraced silence, learning not to dwell on what lay beyond the parapet. The line demanded a focus that left little space for daydreaming or reflection. Night intensified these challenges. Flares illuminated the battlefield in harsh flashes, revealing broken landscapes and moving shadows. German and British patrols sometimes crossed paths in the darkness, each attempting to avoid unnecessary engagement. Soldiers in the firing line tracked these flares with practiced calm, understanding that sudden light often meant movement or danger. The darkness between flares felt heavier than the night itself, thick with uncertainty. The Ypres salient amplified these tensions because of its topography. Surrounded on three sides by higher ground, British positions were under near-constant enemy observation. This meant that even small movements, lifting a helmet above the parapet, repositioning a sandbag, lighting a cigarette, could draw fire. Soldiers learned to move cautiously, relying on the cover of shadows and the timing of patrols. Even tasks that seemed simple in other contexts required strategy. Despite all of this, the firing line was also a place where quiet resilience flourished. Soldiers supported one another not through grand gestures but through subtle signs, a nod from an NCO, a shared look between comrades, a hand steadying another as he stepped onto the firing step. These moments formed a kind of emotional scaffolding that helped men endure the constant pressure. You observe how the front line, though often still, carried immense weight. Its silence was not empty. It was filled with the tension of uncertainty, the discipline of observation, and the endurance of men who understood that danger did not need to announce itself loudly. The line they held was fragile, shifting, and essential. Holding it required patience, awareness, and a steady acceptance of the unknown. In the Ypres salient, courage took many forms. Sometimes it meant charging across open ground. More often, it meant standing quietly in a narrow trench, listening to the night, waiting for sounds that might signal the next moment of movement, or the next moment of survival. When the line finally lets go. The order arrives not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that spreads through the trench like a slow warmth. A lieutenant passes the word from man to man, his voice steady, "Prepare to be relieved." No one cheers. No one slumps in immediate relief. The men simply absorb the words, letting them settle into worn muscles and tired minds. This is how the firing line releases its grip, not suddenly, but in measured steps. You observe the subtle shift as the information moves across the trench. Shoulders ease, just slightly. Faces remain expressionless, but eyes soften at the edges. The tension that has held them taut begins to loosen, though no man dares to relax fully. They know the truth. The final moments in the firing line can be as dangerous as the worst bombardment. A careless movement, a flare at the wrong time, a sniper's patient aim. Danger lingers until the last boot steps away. A sergeant moves along the firing step, checking each position with quiet efficiency. "Gather your kit," he murmurs. "Stay low. Be ready." His tone carries both warning and reassurance. He has seen many rotations. He knows how quickly relief can become chaos if discipline falters. A private removes a spent casing lodged between the boards and slips it into his pocket without thinking. Another closes the lid of an ammunition box, brushing mud from the top. These small actions mark the transition, not frantic packing, just the final touches before stepping back into the labyrinth of trenches that lead away from the line. The men shift positions, adjusting straps, tightening belts. A corporal gives the signal to extinguish a nearby lantern. The trench dims, shadows deepening along its length. Above the parapet, the sky is streaked with thin clouds that drift slowly across a muted moon. The air feels colder, sharper, as if acknowledging the movement about to take place. A relief unit approaches from the rear, their steps measured, their presence announced only by the faint rustle of gear. The two groups meet at a narrow junction, passing each other with practiced precision. The arriving men carry the alertness of those stepping into uncertainty. The departing men carry the heaviness of those who have lived within it. A corporal speaks softly to his counterpart, offering brief notes on the state of the trench. "Watch that section near the sap. Weakened timbers. Enemy quiet tonight. 2 flares in the last hour." The exchange lasts only seconds. Then the column of relieved soldiers begins to move. They step away from the firing step, forming a narrow file along the trench floor. The boards creak under the shift in weight. The smell of mud, earth, and cordite clings to their uniforms. Ahead, the communication trench stretches into darkness, its turns familiar yet somehow different, as if the act of moving backward rewrites the landscape. The men move in near silence. The firing line, though a place of tension, feels strangely reluctant to let them go. They glance back occasionally, not out of regret, but out of instinct, ensuring the line remains where it should be, that no sudden burst of gunfire demands their return. The trench widens slightly as they enter the first communication line. A private touches the trench wall with his fingertips, feeling the rough texture of sandbags and wood. He does not know why he does it. Perhaps to reassure himself that the ground is solid beneath him, that he is truly leaving the place where he has spent the longest hours of his life. A distant flare rises behind them. The light casts long shadows before fading. For a heartbeat, the column freezes, listening. No gunfire follows. They continue. As they descend a slope in the trench, the men encounter a shallow pool of water covering the boards. They step through it without comment, boots splashing in the cold. A few hours ago, that sound might have felt risky. Now, it feels like progress, each step pulling them farther from the front's immediate grasp. A sergeant pauses at a junction, counting heads quietly, then signals the column onward. His steady presence guides them through the dark. They trust his sense of direction more than the maps, more than memory. In these moments, leadership becomes a quiet, essential force. The trench bends sharply to avoid a collapsed section. The men file through the narrow gap single file, shoulders brushing the walls. Above them, a piece of torn corrugated iron clings to the edge of a dugout. It rattles faintly in the breeze. No one looks up. They keep moving. A mule team waits farther down, their silhouettes barely visible. The animals shuffle nervously, picking up on the tension of the men and the night. The driver murmurs a soft reassurance to them as the column passes. The men glance at the animals, their tired eyes, their strained breaths, and feel a faint kinship. Everything here bears weight. Soon, the sounds of the front begin to fade. The vibrations grow weaker. The air feels broader, less compressed. The trench walls widen. The ground steadies beneath their feet. Someone exhales softly, a sound almost lost in the shuffle of boots. Another adjusts the strap across his chest with renewed ease. The realization settles slowly, cautiously. They are no longer at the edge of danger. They are still within the war's grasp, but the grip has loosened. A lantern glows ahead, guiding them toward the support line. The relief is not dramatic. It comes in small increments, a deeper breath, a steadier step, the faintest lift in posture. The firing line has let them go, but the weight of it remains on their shoulders as they walk. Relief from the firing line was one of the most carefully coordinated processes in the British Expeditionary Force, yet it remained one of the most psychologically complex moments of a soldier's rotation. Leaving the front did not feel like escape. It felt like easing out of tension slowly, cautiously, as though one misstep could snap the fragile calm holding the moment together. Historically, units in the Ypres salient were relieved on a strict but flexible schedule. Ideally, a battalion spent only a few days at the front before rotating back, but conditions often disrupted this rhythm. Bad weather, heavy shelling, or failed attacks could delay relief for hours or even days. Soldiers learned not to trust the schedule until the relieving unit physically appeared in the trench. Even then, danger lingered. Many casualties occurred during this transition, men exposed on firing steps, concentration lapsing, or sniper activity increasing at predictable moments. The process depended on silence and discipline. Reliefs usually took place at night, when darkness concealed movement. Officers coordinated the timing so that incoming and outgoing columns crossed paths at precise points within the trench network. A quiet word, a brief exchange of trench conditions, and the men moved on. The entire system relied on trust that the relieving unit would arrive on schedule, trust in the NCOs guiding the columns, and trust in the men's ability to navigate the twisting labyrinth without confusion. The emotional weight of leaving the front was considerable. Soldiers felt relief, but also fatigue and a muted sense of disbelief. The firing line had demanded constant vigilance, and stepping away from it felt both freeing and unsettling. The mind, conditioned to maintain alertness, struggled to loosen its grip. Many soldiers described the first minutes of withdrawal as the hardest, not because of danger, but because their bodies had grown accustomed to expecting it. Even after stepping into the communication trenches, men walked with the habits of the front still imprinted on them, shoulders hunched, steps measured, glances cautious. They remained aware of the possibility of stray shells or sniper fire. Only after moving several hundred meters back did their posture begin to shift. The ground felt more stable. The air grew quieter. The vibration of the guns softened. Relief seeped in gradually, as if the landscape itself were allowing them to breathe again. The meeting between units also carried emotional significance. Incoming soldiers brought nervous energy, the sharp alertness of those about to face uncertainty. Outgoing soldiers carried the resigned heaviness of experience. Their brief exchange at the junction symbolized the continuity of the line. The war did not pause. It merely passed responsibility from one group to another. Veterans sometimes gave short, practical warnings: mud bad near the sap, keep your head low at the parapet, quiet tonight, but watch the right sector, not as gestures of camaraderie, but as a way to help the next group withstand the same tension. The withdrawal also highlighted the physical demands of the trench system. Communication trenches could stretch for miles, weaving through the salient like veins through the body. Soldiers marched single file through mud that reached mid-calf in wet seasons, or along duckboards that creaked under their weight. They navigated collapsed sections, waterlogged pits, and narrow bends designed to minimize damage from shell bursts. Moving through this environment while carrying heavy gear demanded both strength and patience, even when relief was close. Night reliefs brought their own challenges. Lantern light distorted distances, shadows hid hazards, and men relied heavily on the steady leadership of NCOs. A sergeant who knew the trench layout intimately could guide a column safely even under poor conditions. This leadership fostered trust and quiet confidence, helping the men maintain discipline during moments when adrenaline might otherwise falter. When soldiers finally reached the support or reserve lines, the transition felt almost surreal. The soundscape shifted: fewer rifles, fewer flares, fewer immediate threats. Men described the sensation as if someone had loosened a tight belt around their chest. Their breaths deepened. Their steps became less deliberate. And yet, a residue of tension remained. The body needed time to understand that danger had receded. You observe how the moment of relief, though brief, carried enormous psychological weight. It represented the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. Not rest, but a different kind of endurance. The firing line had let them go, but the war continued. There were still trenches to maintain, equipment to clean, letters to write, and routines to resume in the rear areas. In the Ypres salient, the quiet strength of soldiers was measured not only in how they held the line, but in how they released it, steadily, cautiously, with the weight of experience carried silently on their shoulders. Aftermath, when the waiting follows you home. When the battalion finally reaches the rear areas, nothing dramatic announces the transition. There is no boundary stone, no line in the mud marking where danger ends and safety begins. The change arrives slowly, almost shyly, in the softening of footsteps, in breaths that deepen without permission, in the way men lift their heads a little higher as the hum of artillery fades into the distance. You observe them as they settle into new spaces. Not comfortable spaces, just different ones. A barn repurposed into sleeping quarters. A sagging wooden hut with a stove that smokes too much but warms just enough. A row of tents along a hedgerow where the wind threads through the canvas and rustles the ground beneath. The men drop their packs with a heaviness that reveals how tightly they have been held by the frontline hours. They sit on crates, lean against walls, remove helmets and rub their scalps with stiff fingers. Their shoulders loosen in increments, like knots softened by rain. Fatigue does not arrive all at once. It rises gradually, like mist settling over a field. A private unlatches his equipment pouch with hands that tremble faintly. Not fear, just a slow return of sensations he pushed aside for too long. A corporal leans back against a timber post, closes his eyes, and lets the quiet seep into him one slow breath at a time. The trenches demanded alertness even in stillness. Here, for the first time in days, stillness belongs to them. The waiting they carried lingers, though. Waiting is not something a man sets down easily. It clings to the edges of thought, echoing in the pauses of conversation, humming beneath the crackle of the stove. The body remembers the hours spent listening for danger. It takes time for that memory to loosen its hold. You see it in the way some soldiers turn their heads at sudden sounds, even when those sounds come from a clattering pot or a creaking door. You see it in how others sit with hands folded, unsure of what to do with the empty minutes now placed gently in their laps. After so much vigilance, rest feels unfamiliar, a country reached after a long journey but not yet understood. Night settles over the rear area with a softness the men scarcely recognize. No flares. No distant machine guns marking time. Only the whisper of wind through the hedges, the muffled murmur of men speaking in low tones, the sigh of boots drying near the stove. Some soldiers fall asleep quickly, exhaustion finally claiming its due. Others lie awake, listening to the quiet with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. The waiting follows them into the darkness. But here, waiting changes shape. It becomes something lighter, gentler. It is the waiting of bodies relearning rest, of minds sifting through days that blurred together in the trenches, of hearts remembering that safety, however temporary, still exists. Morning brings small comforts. A tin of jam opened and shared. Socks hung near the stove. Letters read slowly, folded carefully, opened again. A few men find laughter returning in muted fragments, the kind that slips out unexpectedly and feels like a forgotten language. The routine of the rear areas settles around them. Cleaning gear, repairing uniforms, sorting rations, writing letters, speaking quietly with those who have shared the same narrow trenches and the same long nights. These tasks do not carry the urgency of the front. They move at a pace that feels almost indulgent compared to the sharp, watchful hours they left behind. Yet beneath everything lies the understanding that the cycle will continue. The reserve line waits. The support line waits. The firing line waits. And they will return because the war demands it, because the line must be held, because endurance is not a moment but a rhythm. Still, for now, there is space. Space to breathe. Space to let the tightness in their chests ease. Space to feel the weight of waiting settle not as pressure, but as memory. You observe them in this in-between place, where the world feels both safer and more fragile, where rest is not the absence of strain, but the quiet acknowledgement that they have survived another turn of the cycle, where waiting no longer defines them, but simply sits beside them like a tired companion. And as the day unfolds, as the stove crackles and boots dry and letters are read again, the men allow themselves a small measure of peace, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from endurance. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.